Okay, so I guess I'll just like introduce this. So basically, like, um, we'll go through the agenda in a bit, but like first, I guess to introduce this whole thing. So for the last couple of weeks, myself, Yasmin, Sham, John, New, and Akmal, and like we just started. Daria and Morgan just joined, but we've been like doing this book club where we discuss like a book, and over a few weeks we discuss like sections of the book that we've read together, and sort of talk about subjects and topics related to the content of that part of the book during that week. And so we just finished the book Sapiens, and so we started to go through some like new books that we might want to read. And I recommended that we read Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. Angela Davis is a really famous Black activist who is known for being a prison abolitionist and for her role in like the civil rights movement in the 60s and the 70s in America. And we thought because of like what's going on in the world right now, it seemed like a really prevalent and pertinent issue to talk about like race and the prison system and the prison industrial complex. So we will be going through that. But first, like, I guess we should address the agenda.
Oh, yeah, just a note before that, we didn't expect, well, okay, there's 14 people. I don't know how long it's going to go. The plan was to make this whole thing end up 4, but depending on how it goes, we might go over time. So if we do go over time and you have to leave, just leave if you have to.
And just really quickly, since we have a lot of people, just so that it doesn't turn into like absolute carnage or something, if you want to make a point, just use the nod stuff on the side of like the hand raising and all that. So yeah.
Okay, so why don't we go through the agenda? So the first thing I've written on the agenda is a discussion on what is racism. Okay, wait, let me just explain the agenda. So we're just going through racism, reverse racism, and then if anybody is comfortable, we can talk about our personal experiences, and then we're going into the book. But everyone can just join because you probably know about point 4 and 5, which is mass incarceration and prison abolition anyway, even if you didn't read the book. So on to the first point. What is racism? Do we still abide by the textbook definition of racism? And a discussion on the individual acts of racism versus systemic racism. So would anyone like to give their thoughts?
How about we start with what is racism to start off with, like what is the common accepted notion of the term, and then we can see how much do we would we agree with that, or from our personal experiences or from what we've seen, have we got our own version of what racism actually is? So I don't know if anyone wants to start with what they think racism as a concept is.
Right, okay, I'll just give it a go. So basically, racism is just discrimination and kind of antagonizing people or a group of people based on their like where they belong, whether it would be an ethnic group or by any of their characteristics. They are oh my God, I cannot speak. They're discriminated based on that, and yeah, it's basically the basis of racism. Although currently, obviously, we're talking about Black Lives Matter, but I think it's important to note that racism occurs with a minority group rather than just people of color or the Blacks. Yeah.
I guess like from like what I've been reading in like recent weeks and stuff, I feel like racism, like the textbook definition that we have of racism is kind of like an oversimplification of like the entire act of it, because I feel like racism requires a structure and it involves power. Like a lot of the stuff that we consider to be racist requires some sort of, like the person engaging in the racist act has to have some sort of power because I think like there is obviously like racial prejudice, and you can be racially prejudiced regardless of like your race, ethnicity, whatever. But like to engage in the act of racism, it's an institutional thing that requires power. It requires a hierarchy, a power dynamic, and it's systemic. You know, there are systems in place that continue to subjugate and oppress people, because racism at its core, I think, is all about oppression and subjugation of a minority. And even like in some other cases, it's also subjugation of the majority, like in South Africa or in like Africa in general, in India, etc. Or like any place that's been colonized.
I think there's a few ways to look at racism, and okay, wait, sorry, I forgot to raise my hand. I guess Ashley, you can go.
So I think from my personal opinion, right, is that racism is more common towards people of color, but I wouldn't label it like strictly just towards them. I think it can happen to any race, like anyone. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter the past, what's happened, with your ancestors. I think racism is simply just discriminating against someone's race.
Okay, I'll just go first. So I wanted to say that from what I know, there are like two different levels of racism. So the first is like individual, which is what Nu said just now, with being prejudice, with it being prejudice against a certain group of people based on their ethnic and color, skin color, or racial group. And then there's also a collectivist kind of view of racism, which leads on to like what Zara said, how these prejudice, like the prejudice that, following from Nu's definition, right, like prejudice that we have, that has led to kind of collective, I guess the proper definition would be systemic racism, like a collection of systems that are put in place by people who have prejudice against certain groups of people, and then it's become like this whole system. So I think, what I'm trying to say is just that I agree with, I think that the two definitions that Nu and Zara both gave are very much linked throughout history. Morgan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think what I was going to say is I was reading something similar to what Zara said a minute ago, and I agree with what Ashley is trying to say, but there's a difference between racial prejudice and racism itself, and I wasn't really aware of it until I read into it a bit further. And it's the idea that how the power structures uphold and perpetuate racism. And so in that sense, like white people, what I mean to say is they obviously can be racially, they can experience racial prejudice, but they can never really experience racism based on the beliefs and values and the way in which the power and history has ever like really been established. So I guess in that sense, what I'm trying to say is that you need to find the right line when you're talking about racism and racial prejudice.
Eden, you can go, and then Nu and Ashley.
Right, okay. I'm just going to give an example, and we can just discuss it. I've heard a lot of people call all white people colonizers, and in my opinion, there is nothing more racist than targeting an entire ethnic group with a collective crime, regardless of the innocence or guilt of its individuals. And that is exactly what you're doing by calling all white people colonizers. And I think the equivalent of that would be calling all African Americans in the US criminals. Just because, and I don't, by the way, I don't have an ancestor who was a colonizer, but just because someone has an ancestor who was a colonizer, right? That doesn't make their daughter or their granddaughter a colonizer as well. And also, if you are comparing the two, would you say that an African American who was a criminal in prison, if you are comparing the two, then you would also assume that his son is also a criminal in that sense. If you are suggesting that there is a comparison between all white people being colonizers and all African Americans being criminals. And that's all I want to say. Like, that is just my opinion. You can disagree with it. You can agree with it however you want. I've seen like posts on social media basically calling out all white people for being oppressors and colonizers. And it actually disturbs me to a core because it divides people rather than uniting people. And Black Lives Matter is all about uniting people. You know, it should be about raising Black people in America to the standard that they should be at, not degrading all white people for their actions in history. And that's all I want to say.
Okay, so the people like New and Ashley, did you raise your hand to make a point, like a separate point, or do you want to use your hand raising for to address Eden's point that she just made?
I was gonna say something else in response to Morgan, but it also kind of relates to Eden as well.
Okay, so does anyone just so New, you can speak now, I guess, and then we can go back and respond to what Eden just said.
You can go ahead, it's fine. I'll just raise my hand.
Okay, I guess who wants to, okay, so if you raised your hand to respond to Eden's point, like just turn on your mic.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it's a fair point, and I don't think it's fair that you should be calling all white people colonizers and so on. But I think where there's a line is the fact that, I mean, yes, people of color, African Americans, they get called words as well, but it's the fact that racism towards people like them isn't just verbal, but it's actually systematic, and it's because of that. I mean, institutions have been set up to actually hold them back in certain ways, and because of that, they don't have the same opportunities that so many other people have, and I don't think that's fair. And if we compare that to, I don't know, maybe a white person, yes, I'm not saying that they can't experience racism. I mean, they can get called words, but I don't know how far that would, you know, inhibit them from actually growing as people in the real world. Whereas if you look at an African American, yes, they get called words, but it's also systematic. They get oppressed in many other ways. They get inhibited from joining jobs and so many other things as well. So I think there's a line from where racism exists and where it can exist within institutions. So yeah.
So like onto Eden's point about how like I agree, like maybe being called like names and stuff, it's not exactly nice, but I think when people are calling them colonizers and stuff, I think it's more or less, I think the conversations that have been had on social media, it's like, yes, colonization and the colonial empires and stuff, that might have happened hundreds of years ago, but we have to start recognizing that white people today continue to benefit from those colonial structures and the legacy of colonialism, whether that's like the whole thing about like white privilege. And you also mentioned that, like, you know, when an African American gets called a criminal, like that, we don't assume that like their kid is a criminal. Maybe not, because we in our heads think like, oh my God, like we don't want to think that because that's racist. But there is literally a system in place that assumes that they're criminals. That's the whole prison industrial complex in the United States that goes for African Americans and people of color specifically because they're demonized. And like, I mean, there's like a whole system in place, just like Shem was saying. And that's, I think, the thing about systemic racism and just how violent and how vile it is, because I mean, it's not nice to be called names, okay? It's really not. But like, at the same time, those names that people call you aren't going to hold you back in the system. They're not going to prevent you from getting opportunities. They're not going to prevent you from reaching an economic standing. You know, they're not going to prevent you from getting a job. They're not going to prevent you from getting a house. They're not going to prevent you from dying at the hands of the police, or they're not going to have you die at the hands of the police, you know what I mean? And like, that's the whole thing. And I mean, it's fair to say, like, it's really not nice to face racial prejudice. And I will say, like, just like what people might think of me, white people do experience racial prejudice. And like that is it. Like, there are stereotypes about white people that are had and that people think. But like, you also have to think that like racism for people of color, you have to live through it every single day. You can't separate yourself from that because you are your race, and that's the conversations that are had about you. That's how you view yourself within society, particularly in like white dominated spaces. I guess that's all I'm gonna say. Like, I have nothing else to say.
I'm just gonna add to that because I think obviously there are stereotypes against, you know, every single race and being, you know, stereotyped against. That's not particularly nice. But what I think is there are absolutely systematic racism for all races across the whole world. Our conversation right now is particularly in the West more, particularly America, and that's where the minority are the African Americans, and the people in power are the whites, and that's why the white people have privilege that puts them in power, that puts them able to like control these systems against African American people. However, racism is not just towards people of color, you know, because like here in Asia, the minority are the white community, and they are also oppressed and they are also limited from the resources they can, you know, like get, like housing and even just like leisure, anything. There's always a different price. There's always a different price point. There's always like different rates, etc. And yeah, it's for the benefit of the economy, but at the same time, they are treated differently because of their race. So I think systematic racism happens everywhere, but it happens against the minority community, not particularly the African American community.
I think what I'm getting a bit confused on is whether we're just speaking about systematic racism, or are we talking about in general racism? Because I find racism to be more of an umbrella term, which is inclusive of systematic racism. But I think racial prejudice also falls under that umbrella term. And there's a lot of other, you know, like personal racism. Like if you were prejudiced against someone based on their race, like individually, I would have thought you are being racist towards that person. And yeah, the definition isn't like great, but it is what racism is, what I find it to be, and what I think a few other people find it to be. And I agree strongly with Nu. In America, white people may not suffer at all, or very little, but every country is going to want to value their native people over anyone else. It's that's just the way the world works. Every country's patriotic. You're going to value your own family over anyone else. So obviously a country's going to value themselves. Yeah, Daria. Okay, white people aren't native to the US, but okay, then let's take England, right? Obviously white people are going to be valued more in England because they are native to that country, but it happens everywhere. You know, in Malaysia, Malay people are going to be valued over a lot of other people. In China, Chinese people are going to be valued over everyone else. It happens everywhere. And I think we keep closing it in on America, which is obviously where the main issue is. But I think we should also be aware that it's different in every country, and to generalize it under one country, I think might become an issue.
Eden.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Is this to address Ashley's point or just like a new point?
Yeah. Okay. I would just like to say, Zara and Nu, I do both agree with your points that obviously in the West and specifically America, there is going to be systemic racism towards minorities, you know, Native Americans, African Americans. And it is, as I said, abhorrent. And when we go on to talk about the prison industrial complex, it's an incredible thing that it is happening and no one really is aware of it, or people are aware and not actually doing anything about it. But I also want to draw attention to the word systemic. And and I do agree with Ashley's point that racism as an umbrella term is systemic in every single country in the world. And I do believe that the US has an incredibly big problem with racism, historically and recently. And but I also think that there are issues about racism and race in particular in Asian countries, as well as South American countries, Middle Eastern countries, and it is important to talk about Black Lives Matter, and it is important to talk about African Americans and their position in society in the US. But it is also important to acknowledge, as Ashley said, that countries, and I acknowledge Dara's point that whites were not native in the US, but unfortunately, white Protestants colonized America, and they set up systems in which they could use that power to oppress minorities. And that is a fact. Okay, that is a fact that they set up educational facilities, they set up governments, they set up prisons, and they use these institutions to oppress minorities. And that is a fact. And I'm not denying that, and I don't think Ashley is denying that. But what we are suggesting that there is more to racism than what happens in the US, and there is more to racism than what is covered by the media. And I think that is also a big issue. Yeah, that's all.
Okay, we're gonna move on to the next point in a second. Well, not in a second, but like, does anybody have something like they really want to say, like in response to Eden's point, or like a new point entirely? Because New and Morgan have raised their hands. Just a second, be right back.
Okay, I don't know what you're about. I'm just gonna quickly add to that, to Ashley's question about the term racism in general. Yes, you can be called names. Yes, you can be prejudiced. Yes, you can be subject to stereotypes. However, I think what we're talking about here is more of a systematic thing where your lives are altered by this, where you don't have access to certain healthcare or certain education because of your race. I think that's more of the problem that we're like kind of talking about. John, you just fart.
Me?
Okay, yeah, but I don't think we're particularly talking about like stereotyping, name calling. Obviously it is bad, but that's more of just prejudice, discrimination, but not as much from systems that you live in,
But you also have to wait, sorry, Morgan. You have to call a spade a spade. No one is arguing that the discrimination faced by whites are to the equivalent level of that of a person of color, but ultimately they still face discrimination, and you call a spade a spade. A murder is a murder, regardless of whether or not it's a single stab wound or full-on mutilation, right? Do they experience racism and discrimination? Yes. Is it to the extent and to the level of preponderance that people of color experience? Maybe not. But for you to entirely negate and disregard their experiences just because of the difference, I feel it's wrong.
I think
That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying.
Sorry.
I wanted to add a point to
Yes,
John. I also wanted to say that not all white people have the same opportunities. So just because you're white in color doesn't mean you're like equal to, like, not all white people are also on the same level, because the US has a lot of immigrants that are white. And just because you look white, you might have a particular name, or you might come from a particular country. And in that sense, like, you might not be able to get jobs as easily. You might not get into school as easily. Like, for example, like, just gonna bring myself up as a Russian, with my name or my passport, being white, I still don't have the same equal opportunities as someone from a country that is also a white country, like in quotes, a white country, because my country isn't seen on the same level as another country, but I'm still white. So technically you would say I don't experience inequalities, but I do still, even though in color I'm white. So I don't think that's fair to say that all white people are like have like amazing opportunities and have equal opportunities.
I definitely don't. I'm not trying to invalidate that white people have faced difficulties in their lives, but I think where the focus of like not just this conversation but the whole movement is about recognizing that yes, white people go through hardships too, like that happens, and not trying to invalidate that, but people of color are at like a lower kind of standing point right now than white people. But I'm not trying to invalidate anyone's experiences. And I think that I know Eden and Morgan have raised their hand, but I do think that we should try to move on to the next point. So if Morgan and Eden, you just give your points, and then we'll move to reverse racism, because I think that a lot of the things we're discussing right now would very benefit the talking about the second point, just because we're kind of like overlapping points right now. Okay, Morgan.
So quite quickly, I read this thing the other day, and it was about, again, the whole term of white people, and obviously that's a very vague term, and the idea was expressions of racial prejudice towards white people may hurt the white person people and are never to be condoned. However, they do not have the power or authority to affect the white person's social, economic, political privilege and whatever. And obviously, I think that is a very, very broad term, just casting all white people into this structure as such. And I believe in the West, this could be largely applicable, such as in the United States. I mean, if we're ignoring Daria's perspective, which obviously I'm not meaning to do, and I don't condone that at all, but just say a homegrown American in this situation that doesn't have the power to affect that white person's social, economic, political, whatever power. However, with regards to an African American person, systemic racism and the establishment of the country as such have procedures or processes that disadvantage African Americans. So I feel like that's largely applicable in the West. But then as a white person in Malaysia, I obviously understand the whole concept of white privilege, but I struggle to also understand where racial prejudice and racism tie in, because personally, you have to pay double sometimes the fees that you would normally do as a Malaysian person when you're trying to stay at a hotel at Tioman Island, or as someone that wanted to play football at Johor Tigers or even get a trial there, you're unable to access that opportunity due to the fact that I'm a Westerner. So I'm just trying to work out, like, do you think it's possible for racism and racial prejudice to change as you change your location around the world as such? So surely the term racism and racial prejudice are open to discussion in almost every single format.
Yeah, following on, I just want to say quickly that so basically, it is unfortunate that this issue is very divisive. And I read something as well that if this issue, racism and systemic oppression in the United States, wasn't so divisive, then people would be able to overthrow the power structures that are in place that prevent people from succeeding in society. And it is unfortunate that when we talk about racism, it divides. Obviously, by definition, it does divide between race, but it is unfortunate that it makes people very, very opinionated. And it is a shame, because if people weren't so opinionated on the issue, like many other issues, we would be able to overcome this sort of thing. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. And you can move on to the next topic now.
Okay, we're gonna move on to the next point, which I'll just read out. Hold on. So the next point is, well, it was basically the same thing, but it's more about this idea of like reverse racism against white people, which like I know is an incredibly controversial issue. And like I know I've gotten into like arguments about this. I guess like I'll just say a few things. I think that like personally, I don't think reverse racism exists. Like, I know like you guys are bringing up your experiences and stuff, and like I in no way mean to invalidate that, but because my own experiences with racism, particularly as somebody, as a woman of color who's been in white spaces her entire life, like in like foreign countries, like I'm not talking about like in white places, I'm talking about in the Middle East, I'm talking about like in India, I'm talking about in Malaysia. Like I sometimes I think like when you're talking about like the Western, like, you know, like you have to pay more prices, like I'm sorry, that sucks that you have to pay a little more. But at like the same time, it's like, are you being treated as an expat or a white person? Because like that's like the thing that I just want to ask. Like, are you being treated like an expat or a white person? And also, I think like the whole conversation around like reverse racism, I think, is incredibly. It undermines the entire conversation that people are trying to have around like being anti-racist. Because I think that when you sort of bring up this idea of like reverse racism, you're like, okay, well, you can also be racist towards white people. And a lot of the time that's only brought up to in conversations that people of color are discussing about racism. And like I want to say that like the racism that is faced by people of color is like far worse than what white people experience. Like I will say that off the bat, like because it's systemic and it's institutional. So not only are you called like mean things, you're also put at a disadvantage within the institutions that you're trying to navigate. And like the whole point, the thing about it undermining anti-racist work is like it sort of just dismisses white privilege there and then. Because if you start saying that white people, because racism is oppression, racism is a tool used to subjugate and oppress. And as soon as you bring that into the conversation, it's like you dismiss this idea of white privilege and what it means to have white privilege. It is so important that white people begin, because I know a lot of white people, maybe not you guys, it's the shoe, if the shoe fits, but I know a lot of white people fail to recognize their white privilege or want to dismiss the concept entirely. But I promise you, there are so many readings out there that show you what kind of privilege it is. It is being able to walk into like all white spaces or spaces of like your entire race or like of mixed races and not having to feel uncomfortable, you know? It's being able to walk into a space, into a shop and not feel like you're going to get harassed or like you're going to get followed because you've got a hijab on your head or because you're a little darker than everyone there. It's like the fear of not having to get like accosted in an airport and stuff. It's the fear of like thinking like, oh my God, am I going to get like paid less than my white peers, or like I have to work twice as hard as my white peers because I'm a person of color and I don't want to seem like I'm a stereotype. It's like not wanting to fit that stereotype, you know? And like I am not in any way trying to invalidate like if you've been called like names, because that's not okay. It's not okay. And I know it feels terrible to be called names, but I think it's so important to recognize that like when you're talking about like reverse racism and you continue to bring that up, you in effect undermine all the anti-racist work that is being done, because you're just dismissing the fact that people of color around the world are they face a lot of prejudice, and they face, and like the power dynamics in play around the world because of the legacy of colonialism are very different. I know for a fact that in Malaysia, white people are put on a pedestal. In Petronas, which is the government oil company, the Malaysian government oil company, mostly white people occupy the top positions and are revered by their employees, which is crazy to me because like they are treated differently and in a good way to the native Malay employees. So, I mean, look, I don't mean to invalidate anyone's experiences, but it's really important that we recognize this and how reverse racism and talking about it and like having like this idea that it exists is so counterproductive to the whole, you know, thing, because like for people of color, everything is about race, and it should be for white people too. Okay, I'm done.
That was an interesting point, and I'm gonna raise something up just to add to the argument, but like not argument, discussion. But yeah, and then I'll add my opinion later. But like this concept of reverse racism, right? Since we were talking about racism and how it's against a minority group rather than just African Americans, I think we also need to realize that reverse racism is against the privileged group. Whether that's in Asia where the privilege exists, elsewhere, I'm not trying to say where yet, but I think that we need to recognize that yes, in the West, the privileged group is definitely white privilege against the minority, which is the people of color. But yeah, I think just to add to the discussion, that we should be really talking about the privileged group rather than white specifically, because they do need to acknowledge their privilege in order to, continue this discussion. Yeah.
I think that wait, is it my turn? Yes. I think that even in Malaysia, white people still have privilege because they have the generational wealth that their parents, grandparents, great grandparents who might have colonized Malaysia, and they come here, and I think that no matter, maybe like this will I don't know, hurt some of your okay, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I don't want to be offensive, but I just think that white people do have privilege wherever they go because they have inherited the wealth, and the systems that they have been in have given them access to education, healthcare, without having to face struggles of getting it. And say in Malaysia, for example, when a white person comes over to Malaysia, they still have privilege because like they moved all the way with their own money. And also, if we say that reverse racism is real, we have to think about the implications. If we say that reverse racism is real, one of the implications would be that programs focus on the people of color, and affirmative action. Affirmative action is when you like put quotas like specifically to like help people of color I don't know, get into school, get jobs and stuff like that. If we say reverse racism is real, then we're saying that POC focused programs and affirmative action is racist. And is that constructive? Like, I think I'm kind of echoing Zara's point. Like, is this constructive to fight as an anti-racist if we say that reverse racism is real? Because if reverse racism is real, then we have to say that, oh, affirmative action is racist. And then it just doesn't help the people who need helping right now.
Sham, you're up.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I was gonna say, I was actually just looking at Akmal's point when he was saying all lives matter against Black Lives Matter. I think saying, I mean, yes, I agree with Morgan with the fact that white people have experienced racism as well. But I don't think it's fair to say that only colored people experience racism. I think everyone in the world experiences racism. But as John and Zara and Yasmin were saying, it's the extent to which they experience that racism and where it actually crosses over from just insults with words to systematic and racism in those kinds of ways. And I mean, if we look at what Akmal was saying here with all lives matter, I mean, that really undermines the issue that we need to address now. And I mean, if we look at which racial groups are being oppressed to the largest extent, we're looking at obviously at this current moment African Americans in the US, right? And I mean, I don't know how long it would take, maybe a few hundred years for us to become completely equal in every way. But in the short term, if we want to solve racism, the people we start with the issues that are most or prevalent at the current moment of time. And I don't know, an analogy I would look at with this is, I don't know, maybe like economic inequality. We wouldn't solve wealth inequality by giving everyone the same amount of attention. No, how do we solve that now? We solve it by looking at the lowest earning group and we give them welfare. We do things to try to lift them up. And if we carry that over to a race perspective, that's why we need to pay attention to the current people who are being oppressed. And we have to pay attention to them more than we pay attention to anyone else. And I think by saying things like all lives matter, we're undermining what the real issue is. And I'm not saying that white people experience racism isn't an issue. It is an issue. But if we're looking at what we need to address right now, we have to focus on who are currently being oppressed. So yeah, that's just what I have to say.
Okay, Ashley, you're up.
It's quite difficult because I feel like it's different in every other country. Obviously, if you were to go around America screaming "All Lives Matter," yeah, I agree. It does kind of silence the Black Lives Matter movement, but I I think people view that as trying to be racist and purposely trying to get rid of Black Lives Matter, which it is a really blurred line. Because let's say I were to, if I say out loud that I believe reverse racism exists, it's not me trying to say that that white people suffer from racism as much or more than people of color. It's not me trying to silence Black people's voices. It's simply me trying to say that, look, okay, it's definitely 100% happening more frequently to people of color, but if we just need to hit every problem as it comes, right? If we leave the fact that white people can be insulted for the next hundreds of years, then eventually it's just going to get worse and worse and build up. Like, it's similar to what happened 200 years ago. You know, white people would treat people of color like absolute trash. No one spoke up about it because everyone thought it was okay, and it became such a big issue that it's affecting us today. So I I'm not trying to say that we should completely disregard the BLM movement or silence other people's voices. I'm just trying to say that by saying reverse racism exists is not trying to say that it's worse or the same. It's definitely not. It's nowhere near as prevalent. Um, but it, as I started with, it entirely depends on which country. Um, like in Malaysia, white privilege exists 100%. White privilege exists everywhere. Um, but then there is Malay privilege, which does overwhelm white privilege, which is much stronger than white privilege in Malaysia, um, and that is recognized in law. So yeah, white privilege exists, but just because it exists doesn't mean it's always the strongest. You have to recognize everything as a whole, not just focus on one specific bit. Don't just, point the finger at white people when in other countries it's different.
Um, shit, what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, okay, so I guess, I mean, like, what you were saying about, like, 200 years before, I mean, like, fair, but, like, at the same time, I don't think people of color, like, anytime soon are, like, pillaging, raping, committing mass genocide, and causing mass famines and stealing resources. That leaves a ridiculously long legacy that continues to create poverty gaps that exist in those native countries. Fuck. Oh, yeah. So you're talking about like the Bumi Putra laws, and I mean, Malay privilege exists, but it exists in the vacuum of Malaysia, because me and Yasmin's Malay privilege does not exist in Thailand. It doesn't exist in Vietnam, and it doesn't exist in America. And like you just said, white privilege exists everywhere. And the whole thing about reverse racism is that it fails to recognize white privilege, or it dismisses, or it is used as a tool to dismiss it entirely. And as Sham said, it's not constructive to bring it up. And like, we're bringing it up now because I guess it's a nice point for discussion. But like, when you're talking about it like anywhere else, it doesn't make sense, because like we're saying about like the all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter thing, like people of color around the world, like whether you want to recognize it or not, like they're suffering to a great extent. The leftovers of colonial legacy show up everywhere. Colorism is a very real thing left behind by white supremacy, and it denies people who are darker skinned economic opportunities, job opportunities, housing opportunities. If you are lighter skinned, you're more likely to like get a job, you're going to be higher paid. There have been studies that have been done that prove this. And like, I in no way mean to invalidate anybody's individual experiences, but I think like, because my own view of racism, and for a lot of people of color, like the view of racism is that there has to be power involved. And like, people of color like really don't have that power. We really don't. Like, because I don't know, like, I just don't think we have that power, because even if we were, I still feel unsafe in like all white spaces, and like I'm living in the majority, like I'm the majority here. I'm like and it's not just about like, racism isn't just about oppressing the minority, because like South Africa happened. You know, colonialism happened, and that's the minority oppressing the majority. So it's a lot more nuanced than that. It's who has the power. And I just don't think that people of color at this moment in time, we don't have that. And when we live in a post-racial society, then we can address that if it ever comes up. Okay, that's it. Yasmin's next.
Okay, so I just want to, this is in regards to Ashley's point. I just wanted to say that, like, I'm not saying, and I don't think anybody here is saying that white people should or can be insulted. And I think that fundamentally we're disagreeing on the definition of prejudice and racism. And this kind of links back to Sham's point, where he said that, Sham, you said that you think white people face racism to a smaller extent. But for me, like, I disagree. I think what white people, at least from what I've read, there's a difference between prejudice and racism, which is what Morgan brought up earlier in the session, where he said that prejudice is when you treat someone differently and it's on like an individual level, but then racism is prejudice, but also plus power, like Zara said, because it's kind of entrenched in the system or governing body of a country. And also, I don't remember whose point it was, but I just wanted to say that, like, in Malaysia, for example, Malay privilege over white privilege, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think white people still have privilege because Malay people still idolize white people so much. And just going back to Zara's point, yeah, white supremacy and colonialism has left colorism to be like such an important issue in Malaysia. For example, Indians in Malaysia get discriminated so much. There's like racial slurs specifically for Indian Malaysians because they're darker, because it's seen as like something bad. And that, I think that's something that has remained from colonial times. And also the whole thing with Bumiputra laws, I think that that's targeted to citizens. Like when white people move to Malaysia, they're expats. So that's why they don't get the same prices. That's why they have to pay double to go to Legoland or Sunway Lagoon, because they're expats, not necessarily because of their race. Because you could have a tourist, okay, not tourist, like an expat from somewhere else, not a white country, come, and they would still have to pay extra because they're an expat. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Right, okay, I just want to say one thing. Whenever you say we're not going to invalidate your experiences, you do invalidate our experiences. I'm not saying mine, but specifically other people. It's like saying no offense, but you're fat. We do take offense, regardless of saying no offense in front of it. Also, I just wanted to point out that, yes, Ashley did say that there is white privilege in Malaysia. He said it a number of times in what he was saying. But he also said that there is also native privilege in other countries, okay? Like there is African privilege in African countries, like I said, in Zimbabwe. Yes, there is a history of colonialism, but what I'm asking is, do you think that just because white people stole natural resources through colonialism, it is right today to rape, pillage, and murder? And I know I have family members in Zimbabwe who have been imprisoned multiple times just because they're white, regardless of if their ancestor is a part of colonialism. And I think that is important to recognize that native privilege exists in native countries, regardless of if it's, you know, Japanese privilege, Malaysian privilege, African privilege, Saudi Arabian privilege, or you know, American privilege. And I think, yeah, and I think, Zara, you make a good point about the vacuum thing. But thanks, John. I think it might have to do with what Ashley said, because he said that white privilege is everywhere, and he acknowledged that. It's not like we're not acknowledging that we have privilege in the countries that we live in, but there has to be an acknowledgement that there is also privilege for people of color. And unfortunately, as I've said before, it's an incredibly divisive topic, because yes, there is, you know, a lack of privilege for African Americans in America, and there's a lack of privilege for Native Americans in America as well. but there is also privilege for them in their own countries. And that's all I wanted to say. It doesn't mean that I am negating your points. It doesn't mean that I'm saying that all lives matter. I'm not saying that. I'm not agreeing with that point at all. I'm just saying that there needs to be an acknowledgement about global privilege. And I actually don't like the word reverse racism. I just wanted to say that. I don't like the word reverse racism because, as I said, I believe that racism is an umbrella term. I think racism can happen to anyone, you know, regardless of their circumstances. And I think reverse racism makes it sound like there are two sides, which in itself is fundamentally what is destroying the Black Lives Matter movement. Because when you divide people, that is when protests do not achieve what they aim to do. If you're trying to unite people, don't use the word reverse racism, because that in itself makes people angry. If you're trying to unite people, you should acknowledge that there is privilege in all countries with all races, but you should also acknowledge that African Americans and Native Americans do not have as much privilege as white people do. And, you know, that's why I would say that reverse racism does actually cause more problems than creating solutions. And what we should be talking about is how we can create solutions. We shouldn't be pointing out specific circumstances of racism. I agree that it adds a specific point, but it is important to recognize that reverse racism in itself sort of destroys your argument in a sense. And that's all I wanted to say.
So could I just throw out one quick thing that I just came to my head about Malaysia on the whole and racism that exists in Malaysia? I completely agree that white privilege exists in Malaysia, and I've experienced it. And am I fortunate to be a white person? Like, obviously, yeah, of course I am. But forget about white people in Malaysia. I just want to know what Yasmin and Zara have to say, because I feel like in Malaysia, on the whole, there's yeah, Sham. I feel like on the whole, there's a huge hierarchy between people that come from all across Asia, so all across other Asian countries, and it exists at Marlborough, as in the workers are practically on a hierarchy in the estate staff based on the country that they're from. So I just wanted to know really what your perspective is on that, if we're just talking about racism amongst coloured people in Asia and in inter-Asian countries, because clearly there's always going to be a hierarchy that exists. Thank you.
Okay, so to explain, racism very much exists in Malaysia, and not just like against the people in Malaysia, but also like people, you know, like workers that come from like Indonesia, Bangladeshi people, Indonesian people, and that very much exists, and that's like a problem in our community. I am not denying that at all, and like thank you for asking, thank you for wanting to learn more. But in Malaysia, the three main races that, well, the government are always like one Malaysian, it's Malay, Chinese, Indians. But the fact is, the way our legal system is built, Chinese Malaysians and Indian Malaysians don't get the same privilege as us. They are called names. They're also kind of put in a stereotype as well, and that's not right. That is racist. And then in regards to your question about like the way Malaysian community perceives like immigrant workers, I very much agree that like it is horrible. And in fact, some of you might have heard that during maybe like 2 weeks ago, there were cleaners who aren't like Malaysian citizens who work here, who were protesting for like more rights, and they were detained. And I mean, I've witnessed discrimination against like Indonesians in my own family. Like my people in Malaysia like usually have helpers, and the helpers are Indonesian, and the way they treat helpers sometimes can be like horrible. Like they'll hold on to the helper's passport, they'll hold on to the helper's phone, they'll like, you know, it's just not humane. And I think that that is very much a problem in Malaysian community. So to answer your question, yes, it happens, and I recognize it But sadly, like a lot of people here just think it's normal, which is horrible. And hopefully like we'll start talking about it and it will change. But yeah, when people see Bangladeshi, people from Nepal, people from Indonesia, they will call them derogatory terms, which is not okay. That's it.
I just wanted to make a short point about reverse racism. I think that I think as all of us can agree, there's definitely prejudice against white people and like, for example, verbally. But I think what's important to acknowledge is that there's no systematic racism, or at least to an extent that I would acknowledge it as an issue. And that's why I think that people can agree on that reverse racism does exist, but the fact is it's not really an issue. And I think that's why it becomes very confusing for people when people are trying to argue that reverse racism is trying to silence Black people and the Black Lives Matter movement, when in reality it does exist, but it shouldn't be deemed as a more important issue than the Black Lives Matter movement. And also with native privilege, as a person who's British Indian and I have a British passport, you would think that I would experience native privilege in my own country, but from personal experience, like being in England, I do feel a sort of sense of being uncomfortable, especially since I'm a person of color, not necessarily a white British person. So I think there has to be some sort of fine line in which we can define that native privilege, and just because, there are people of different color who are obviously from that country, but are still not treated the same because of their color, not just because of their nationality.
Okay, thanks. That's really great, guys. Shit. I'm swearing a lot in this, and this is being recorded and probably going to be published. So this is going to be really bad for me. Okay, so we're going to move on to talk about the book. Oh, Agong, do you want to say something? Yeah, this is going to be published for like public use, bro. This is, yeah. Okay, anyway. We're going to move on to talk about the book that we read. So we read this book called, like I said in the beginning, Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. And I think like perhaps it's not going to, I'm not sure, because I don't know much about the Malaysian prison system, even though I'm Malaysian. So I can't speak to it here, but it's definitely about the prison industrial complex, particularly in the Western world. So we're just gonna discuss that. And I mean, like, if you want to chime in, that's great. Like, if you haven't like really read the book, or if you know some stuff on the prison industrial complex, but like, I would just say that it's sort of important when we're having such a nuanced discussion that you do have a little bit of background knowledge before you do say anything, because just in case things get confused. All right, so let's begin discussing the book. Yeah, the 13th is great. So like after you leave this and you want to read more, like not read more, learn more about it, the 13th is like one of the best documentaries that I've watched. It's really heartbreaking. And also just watch Angela Davis speak, because she's got an amazing voice. Okay, so let's move on. So anyone from the book club want to speak up first on the book? Anything interesting in particular that came up while reading?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I mean, when at first you talked about the fact that we actually need to reform the prison system and so on, or when I actually first heard about it, I actually thought, okay, why, how? Like, I couldn't actually think of a reason as to why we would need to, because I mean, from everything that I was exposed to in the media and so on up to this point, I personally haven't seen many faults with the prison system. But as I read this book and actually had a look, and yeah, as I watched that on Netflix as well, like, I was completely eye-opening. And I think once we actually start to get more people who have this kind of information as well, I think that's when real change can actually be made. And I think the reason why so many people aren't actually speaking about it is because there aren't enough channels that actually advocate this information, whereas we should be having those channels, because from what I read, I was completely shocked with a lot of them. So yeah, I mean, I'll just start off by saying that, I guess.
I think learning. Oh wait, is it my turn or Morgan? Do you?
No, it's you.
Okay. So just from the book, I think that one of the most kind of like echoing Sham's words, eye-opening information that I learned was that the birth of the prison system was it correlates to the rise of capitalism. And Angela Davis says in the book that during this time and labor was the value in which you judge everything. And so building up prisons means that you get prisoners who could basically just give you free labor, right? So like you're well, in this book it was European context. So in European context, punishment went from like capital corporal to prison, and I just thought that it was like really eye-opening for me to learn that it just makes so much sense for prisons to be created with the rise of a time during the Enlightenment when people wanted to make more products, sell off more products, and then that kind of like leads into the CCA and what Angela Davis was talking about, how the corrections, I don't remember the full name, Corrections Corporation, something like that, the CCA gets paid per prisoner, which leads to them wanting to get more prisoner. And I think that problem is just so entrenched in our system. But I also think the other thing that she said, which is very I don't know what the adjective is, but basically she said that there was a time when people thought they couldn't imagine a world without slavery, and then there was a time where people couldn't imagine a world without like lynching, and then now we can't imagine a world without prison. But in effect, it's just kind of the way that revolutions or any big change happens. Yeah, so that's what I thought.
I think you just talked about the connection between segregation, slavery, lynching, and the role of the prison system. And then Angela Davis posed the question, if racism should not define the planet's future, then this may lead us to take seriously the prospect that prisons should be declared obsolete. And ultimately, I think she also posed the question, which I think could lead to a discussion here, in that, is racism so deeply entrenched in the prison industrial complex in the US, in the institutions of prisons in the US, that it's not possible to eliminate one without eliminating the other? But I think reading briefly about prisons in the US and the similarities that exist there between slavery and penitentiary prison, I think it is really quite striking, and yeah, that's what I have to say.
Yeah, that's like a really good point you brought up. Like, I feel like, I mean, we learn about it in history. We learn about like the 13th Amendment, which basically abolished slavery. But like the whole thing about it was that, you know, the crux of it is, and like the little exception is, except for imprisonment. So you don't have to, like, slavery is illegal except if you're in prison. And like, if you think about it, so many people in the US were sort of reluctant to end slavery, and the idea of slavery ending almost seemed like unimaginable because it was such an integral part of the economy. And so with that sort of loophole in the 13th Amendment, it just gave people an excuse to start, going after Black Americans and Native Americans and brown people in America, because that was essentially just sort of the system of slavery, but in a slightly nicer way. So I feel like, from like reading the book and like knowing what I know about the prison industrial complex in the United States, I feel like in order to really truly sort of achieve like an anti-racist state, the prison can't exist because it's so inherently racist, like the way that people are policed in the US, who gets charged with crimes, who gets convicted, how they're treated in prisons. It's all entrenched in racism, and you have to get rid of one if you want to see something else come to fruition.
Adding on to both Morgan and Zara's point, I did a bit of reading on like prison just in the US, but I'm not a history student, so please correct me if I'm wrong. The prison boom, well, when the prisons were like being filled up with a bunch of people, is kind of during the Richard Nixon era and also the Reagan era. And then at the time with Richard Nixon, there was anti-war left movement, and also like the Black people movement, like that was active. So the way that the president handled it was just to target those communities by launching the right word? I'm not sure, but like launching this like war on drugs because it was so widely used in those communities, and that was like the way that the administration got people in prison. And I'm reading a quote from Nixon's domestic policy chief. So this guy said, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So this quote, when I read it, I felt so heartbroken and just so sad. And I think Zara and Morgan are absolutely right. Like racism is just so entrenched in the system that it might be, abolishing prison might be the way to remove that.
What really caught me from the book was the economic side of it, and I think this is the reason why a reform isn't going to happen anytime in the near future. And I mean, as I spoke about in the last session, just for you all who weren't there, I actually used the example of the environment, right? And the fact that the issue with solving climate change isn't actually scientific. We have 95% of the technology that we need to solve it. It's just whether or not it lines up economically. It's actually whether or not the people in power are actually going to favor what's going to happen. And when it comes to climate change, for example, no, they won't. And that exact same thing aligns with what's happening in this system here. Prisons, economically speaking, work very well. They create jobs. And I think it was a state like Louisiana or something, a quarter of their prisons were public list. They were privatized companies, right? And Yasmin, that company you were talking about, CCA, is actually a public listed company. It's on the stock market, which I just think is disgusting. The fact that you have a prison system, something that's supposed to be a service, that's listed on the stock market. And yeah, as I was saying, economically it works out so well. So many people are making so much money off the prisons, whereby not unless a major reform comes in, which I don't think it will in the next few years at least. Nothing will change, I think. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to add, and also if it gets noisy, just let me know. But to add to the CCA thing, they are paid per prisoner. There is an economic benefit, just like Sham said, and I absolutely do think that racism and the prison system, everything, slavery, it's all interconnected because there's this quote here. It said that, sorry, I'm trying to find it. Police departments in major urban areas have admitted the existence of formal procedures designed to maximize the numbers of African Americans and Latinos arrested, even in the absence of a probable case. So I just wanted to put it out there, kind of like spark some conversation, but I do find it quite like striking that they would admit that. And I'm not too sure about the timeline of this. Maybe laws have changed now and they work a little bit differently, but sorry, the quote: police departments in major urban areas have admitted the existence of formal procedures designed to maximize the numbers of African Americans and Latinos arrested in the absence of a probable case. So they would receive the maximum sentence without concrete evidence, just a probable case, and I just find that quite striking, because that literally shows there's a direct correlation between racism, between slavery, because from this book I realized there's so many similarities between how the system in prison works, the economic benefits from it, and how slavery was back then. So yeah, just a point I wanted to raise.
I think what New just said ties in massively with the idea of Reagan and Nixon's policy of tough on crime and the war on drugs. And the war on drugs was merely a sugarcoating of a war on people of coloured communities in the late 60s, 70s and 80s that carried on all the way up until today. And if you take one example from this period, 1980s, crack cocaine was introduced into the streets in the US. And you already have cocaine and then you have crack cocaine. And crack cocaine was seen to be a largely inner suburban issue. Whereas, I don't know what you would call cocaine, but it was seen more of a drug that would be more commonly associated with white people. So by launching this war on drugs, on crack cocaine, people of African-American communities could largely be cracked down upon. They could be forced into prisons. And the whole idea of this policy was to ultimately, I mean, arguably, yes, it was to break up African-American communities. And it's been present since the 1980s. Yeah.
Aiden, you want to speak?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say I watched the documentary, but I was just gonna point out something that kind of shows that we're really not moving forward with the BLM issue. 1 week, I think, into the protests in Minneapolis, the Minnesota police were disbanded and the federal guard was brought in, I'm pretty sure. And then, you know, Congress were like, oh God, we need to think about a solution to this because we can't have protests during a pandemic and so forth. And what they stated was they would disband Minnesota State Police and instead replace it with a state-funded police force. Now that to me sounds the exact same. Like that is no different. And it just goes to show how politics can be manipulated into sort of serving power and money. And I agree with what the documentary said. And I agree with what Sham said about economics, in that the reason that, essentially veiled slavery is going on within prisons is because of the money that large corporations receive building large prisons. You know, the more you fill, the larger you have, the more income you get. And it is unfortunate that money does run politics. And it just kind of goes to show that we are not really moving forward. We're just sort of trying to cover and veil the racism issue with solutions that won't really help. And that's what I just wanted to point out, because it was ironic that, we're going to disband the police, and people were very celebratory about that. But then they came back later with saying, okay, but we're going to replace it with a state-funded military force, which in my eyes is the same as the police. Yeah.
I agree completely. How like money and politics, sort of, I feel like the more you involve money with politics, the less democratic a nation is. But like, I guess I wrote down some points here. So I think a lot of like what the book addressed is like how the media sort of perpetuates and sort of influences our views of what a criminal is. I feel like for a lot of us, we see criminals, like how they're portrayed in the media sometimes as like these irredeemable like villains, when in reality, I think in particular in like the United States, a lot of people who are within the prison system or who are considered criminals are actually like wrongly convicted. And there was like this one point where she was talking about how like, despite the fact that in like the 90s or the 80s, the fact that like crime statistics and like crime rates were going down, the news media presented crime as though it was like at an all-time high, despite statistics presenting the reality very differently. And like, I just wanted to like ask, like, how do you think, the media has influenced your view of like the prison system and policing and criminality? Because like, to me, like, I feel like I'm unlearning a lot of what I think about criminals and stuff, because I feel like maybe justice needs to be more restorative than like a retributive process, But like, what do you guys think? Like, how has the media influenced you?
So with the media, just wanted to point out like one part of the book, which said that how like Latinos and Black people are misrepresented and like disproportionately represented in the media, which makes people like associate them with crime. Personal experience, I don't really watch. Okay, well, the two cop shows, cop show that I watch, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and the other thing that I watch that has to do with prison is Orange is the New Black, but I kind of forgot everything about it. So I can't say from personal experience, but on retributive justice, just wanted to say that after I read the book, I read a bit into retributive justice, and there's this podcast that I listened to which talked about how like retributive justice looks to ask different questions than restorative justice and retributive justice asks different questions. So while retributive justice asks like who was the perpetrator, what punishment did they deserve, restorative justice would ask something like who was hurt, what do they need, and what can the person who harmed them do to not correct but to make amends, I guess. I know that that's kind of, like if it's like murder or a rape, like that I had the same question when I was reading the book. Like the last chapter is all about restorative justice, and I had the same question of where I was agreeing with Angela Davis, but then in my head it was like, what if there's a murder? What if there's a rapist? Like a rape, and then she explained it at the end where she said that there was what was it? I can't remember. Like a white woman who was killed, and the parents just ended up forgiving and reconciling with the child's murderers, which could happen, but I just don't know how like people would receive that. So I do think restorative justice is something that we should look into and should implement in the system, but I don't know how people would receive that.
Yeah. Sorry. I just have something in my mouth. Sorry, I'm just eating food. Yeah. I think that's a really good point in terms of restorative justice, and I know we keep talking about the faults of the prison, but if real change needs to actually be made, we have to talk about the solution as to what it will look like after the reform. And I think what's on everyone's minds is moving it to a much more restorative platform. And I was thinking about that. I really like that, with the fact that, it shouldn't be a place to actually, punish people, but it should be a place to help people grow and learn, right? And what I was thinking is, I've already seen so many cases online of homeless people or just people who aren't very fortunate who commit crimes on purpose just to get into jail, because the conditions which are in jail are, they can be a lot nicer than what's on the street. Now, imagine if prisons were reformed into this place which mainly focus on restorative justice. Would you not say that it would take away one of the 4 key pillars of a prison, which is to incentivize people not to go to prison in the first place? Which would mean that obviously you wouldn't want to commit crimes, you wouldn't want to break the law, which at the end of the day leaves you not going to prison. Now, if we took away that factor and if we made prison a place that mainly focus on restorative justice, would that, undermine that factor of a prison? I mean, I'm not saying I'm against restorative justice. I'm absolutely for it. But I'm just saying that wouldn't this be a challenge that you would face? But yeah.
Morgan, sorry, can I like interject? Like, are you okay with that?
Yeah, sure. You go first, then I'll go.
I think like the whole thing about like abolishing prisons is that like prisons and like in and of itself, and like especially in America and like the whole system is like, I don't think like even if you made like prison a more humane place, like if you look at like Scandinavian countries, prisons are pretty humane, and it reduces like what's it called, recidivism of like people going back and like committing the same crime and like going back to prison. Like I don't think it incentivizes people. I think the whole thing is when we're talking about like abolishing prison and like that, it's because you don't want to invest in prisons, you want to invest in bettering a community, I think. So like I get what you're saying, like particularly for like homeless people, but like when you bring up the idea of like, because I don't think people like Angela Davis want to necessarily like reform the prison at all, because that just increases its permanence. They want to get rid of it because like the way in which people get into prison is actually racist. So like people don't actually want to go in there, you know? It's more to do with like, we need to reduce the factors that lead them to like wanting to commit crime, such as homelessness, such as poverty, inequality, so that people are, because I think a lot of crime actually occurs because people need like, they're economically insecure, and so like theft happens, murder happens, etc. They're like in bad places because of, you know, inequality and injustice. So like I don't really think it's going to incentivize people, because I don't think anybody wants to be in isolation, because you're getting rid of that anyway. Like, yeah, that's it. Okay, Morgan, you can go.
Morgan, is it okay if I just quickly ask a question again? So Zara, you this isn't me opposing you. This is just me asking a question. What would that look like then if we actually took away the prison system as a whole? Because I mean, it's very easy to say, you know, this is bad. You know, we need these XYZ things instead. But what would that look like to you? You know, what would be the system that would substitute that?
I mean, okay, yeah, actually, Aiden, like, that's a fair point. Like, because to be honest, like, even as I read the book, like, for me, not a lot of like clear solutions are presented for like perhaps the more violent members of society, like rapists and like murderers who aren't necessarily doing it for like out of desperation, but perhaps out of like lust or something. Um, but I think she mentioned it in the book. It's like decriminalizing like drug possession. It's about like reinvesting in impoverished communities, because a lot of crime stems out of poverty. And I think that can be said for communities around the world that are impoverished, that like crime is really like pervasive there because they're in such desperate situations. So like, I mean, I'm not entirely sure. Like, I can't speak to it on like what the world would look like without the prison. Like, as she said, it's almost unimaginable, because that's the only way we think justice can be served and how justice can be achieved. But like, yeah, I mean, I think it's more to do with like, rather than investing in like prisons that not only like kind of mess up the landscape, but that and like destroy lives, but rather coming up with solutions to better the lives of people that are most susceptible, which includes like Black and brown people in the United States. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Okay, Morgan, you can go. I'm sorry that we're interrupting you.
I think also the issue is you need to find the right balance, because obviously prison's a really vague term. You've got people in there for like really petty crimes, and you've got people in there that are mass murderers, serial killers, school shooters. And I think you've got the premise of prison in one side is the threat of sequestering people in dreadful places, which was said by Angela Davis in the book. But then you've also got the idea that you want to rehabilitate and change ultimately the mindsets of people that have committed crimes. So I guess if you want to introduce rehabilitation centers and you want to rehabilitate certain criminals, isn't there a point though where you can't rehabilitate all the prisoners that come in and all of these criminals, because you've got criminals that have to spend their lives locked up in a hole with no windows, and they're only allowed out for 1 hour a day from their cell. Yeah.
Going, please, this is being recorded, so like please don't type anything that's like particularly like inflammatory and stuff, just in case.
I don't know if my like hand raising thing is working or not. But I just wanted to say that if we decide to, well, not we, but in general, if there would be a decision to reform prisons but keep them as an institution, wouldn't there still be a problem of people that are looking after prisoners still being racist and ultimately somehow still damaging the prison system inside itself, due to just the core nature of racists. So if we were to reform a prison, it wouldn't like guarantee that racism within prisons would be gone. So wouldn't it be like a better, not option, but like wouldn't it be a better solution to completely just abolish them? But then you have the other side where a lot of people are talking about obviously having criminals that are particularly very dangerous to a community being out with everyone else. So is there actually a way of making a prison system equal for everyone and completely abolishing racism within a prison system?
I guess because my hand was raised, I'll just talk. I don't know, that's like a really good point because like, you know how like in the US they're talking about like literally abolishing the police or like defunding the police and reinvesting that into like community programs other than policing. I think like you're right that like racism is sometimes so entrenched in a society at like the individual level that like no matter how many like reforms you put in, no matter how many laws you pass to ensure like or hopefully ensure that like discrimination doesn't occur, sometimes that's impossible when you have people within the system who are literally just too racist and who continue to harbor like prejudice and racist mindsets. So like I mean, I think that like that's the thing about this book, because I feel like if you give us one example, that's not enough to explain like what are you going to do with the murders and rapists, because like in my personal opinion, I don't know how I feel about like rapists going about in society after committing a crime. And like the thing is like rapists aren't even convicted that much. Like the percentage of rapists that are actually convicted isn't that much. So perhaps that's already answering our question. And perhaps abolitionists are sort of talking in the long-term view of like, how do we transform society? Because I feel like this book in general really addresses not just like abolishing the prison system, but also like how do you transform society? Because so many of like the issues of crime to me from this book just seem to stem from so many like societal issues. Like, do you like teach like, I don't know, it's really confusing because I just think that like, it's not properly addressed or it's not satisfactorily addressed. Yeah, thanks Agong for that statistic.
On regarding Zara's point, she said that most prison crime issues are societal. I definitely agree after reading the book. I think that this was Sham said this like ages ago, but he asked if it would be a disincentive, if it would incentivize people to not commit crimes if there's no prison, something like that. I'm getting the wording wrong. But what I got from reading the book was that committing that like prison, not wanting to go to prison is not the root cause for not committing crime. Like the cause for committing a crime is usually a societal issue, just like Zara said. And then I thought what was interesting to bring up is that in the book, Angela Davis says that the number of people in prisons who will have mental illnesses are larger than like the whole of the America's mental institutions, which just speaks volume and shows us that there could be some other way to address this. Regarding Morgan's question, I have no idea. And I would be interested to read more about that, like what would happen to people who are in Supermax prisons. But what your question reminded me of the part in the book where Angela Davis said that previously solitary confinement was thought to be like a good punishment because people would, in that time, people were religious and they thought that having time alone would be time to self-reflect and kind of repent. And then now it's like that's the worst possible punishment you could have. So I really don't know how we would deal with people in Supermax prison. And then just like Zara said, I also can't think about like if I would feel safe with murderers and rapists just not locked up. But from what I listened to in the podcast that I talked about in the chat, the person Ezra Klein was interviewing gave an example, and then she said, for example, if this kid steals money from like, I don't know, a businesswoman, and then the restorative justice kind of act to make that okay is the businesswoman wants the kid to pay her back, I don't know, $200, and then how the government could assist in that kind of situation is that the government could like provide transport for the kid to like go to work so that the kid can pay back the businesswoman, something like that. The person that Ezra Klein interviewed gave an example along those lines. So I guess what I just wanted to say was restorative justice. While I think that we should look into it, there are some sections of it that I'm a bit kind of still fuzzy about, and I need to do more reading on it.
Yeah, so what I was just gonna say, I think with your point about the fact that there are actually more mental people in prisons than there are in, you know, actual mental institutions in the US, you know, I mean that just makes you ask, you know, what is the line that separates, you know, a mental institution and an actual prison, and how do we decide if someone should go to prison or an institution instead? And I think, you know, looking at this issue of this maximum security, and, you know, I mean, I find it hard to believe that some people actually think that, you know, locking people up in these holes in the ground with like one light, or, you know, this room with no windows whatsoever, you know, for insane amounts of hours will actually help them in terms of their mental health. And I think, you know, looking, if we would actually reform prisons, and I think Morgan was right when he was saying that you know, it varies in terms of what crimes they commit, and, you know, and it could always be a line of in terms of how severe that crime is, in terms of their mental health, you could make the choice of whether this person needs to be treated in a mental health institution, or whether this person is capable of going to a restorative institution instead. And, you know, I don't think we as soon as someone commits a crime, they should be labeled onto one institution. I think they should have the choice of going to multiple institutions in accordance to what their condition is, whether it's on a mental, I don't know, scope or anything else like that. But yeah, I just think having multiple institutions available would really help it out. But yeah. No, I think you should go. I think Eden just went somewhere.
Okay, okay, I kind of forgot what I was gonna say beforehand, but when you said that, I wanted to add a small thing, like in the book, I'm not too sure if this is correct, like from my memory, but the kind of the SHU, the SHU, is like sensory deprivation and all of that, and it's like interesting because it was set up from a religious standpoint where you're meant to reflect and stuff, but not everyone's religious, not everyone will react the same way as the intention of the person who started that, you know. So what I'm trying to say is that there's so many layers, there's so many different aspects that you need to consider if you're talking about abolishing prisons or reforming prisons. And I think there isn't one solution. I also think that if we're talking about, like Sham said, multiple institutions, and then you choose or anything like that, we would have to reform the entire justice system. Who gets to make the decision of who goes where, and, you know, just set kind of the right institutions to the right kind of people, the right kind of crime, you know. So if we're talking about reform, it's considerably reforming the whole society, because then relating back to what Yasmin said, society is the root cause of crime. And personally, I think corruption is the biggest one of all, in addition to poverty, in addition to, you know, drugs and all of that. But ultimately, corruption is the cause of all this. And if we're addressing one aspect of this, then we need to consider all aspects. And that's going to be quite difficult to come up with a solution maybe in the next 10 years, you know, like it's going to be a long-term kind of reform, and there's going to be a lot of backlash because society does not deal with change. And then a small point before, like, I stop. psychologically, like biologically, we need to have sanctions, we need to have rewards, and prisons, in a sense, is kind of a sanction. Like, don't do this because you don't want to go to prison. So if you're removing that, if you're adding more rehabilitation things, more positive things that they should rightly have, because human rights and just, you know, compassion, but like there is going to be a lot of problem with that within the community, because they need some kind of sanction. Yeah.
Eden, because you were just gone, do you still want to go? Like, you want to go, right?
Yeah, I can quickly
Yeah, go, because I'm going to move on to another point when we stop this.
All right, cool. I just wanted to say that, like, as much as I agree with, you know, reforming the prison industrial complex, I think it's important to acknowledge that, and like, don't hate me for this, I think it's important to acknowledge that prison, when it isn't discriminating against people, is an important, is important as an infrastructure in society. Not on a you know, not on a societal level, but I think on a political level, because I think prison in itself does reassure people in society. And unfortunately, yeah, well, as I'm saying, like, regardless of the discriminatory nature of prisons, I think it's important to acknowledge that abolishing prison in itself, like, it's important to acknowledge that abolishing prisons in itself would be incredibly difficult to come by, because firstly, because I think you know, because of the money and the power in politics, but I also think because it is so entrenched in the United States politics, you know, where people are, you know, the majority being white people in America, but people are incredibly supportive of putting people in prison, and that may be the case because of the inherent racist attitudes within America. But I think we need to acknowledge that it would be incredibly difficult to abolish prison as a whole. And I do agree with having rehabilitation. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's difficult to abolish it because of how race is used to imprison people. And it is sort of a paradox, because people want to abolish it because of the discriminatory nature of prison, but also people don't want to abolish it because people are very scared about race itself. And I'm just saying it's important to acknowledge that. And I think people are scared about race in America because of the media, as previously mentioned, and because of specific domestic politics. And before you abolish prison, I think it's important to reform like attitudes, and obviously that's incredibly hard to do. But abolishing prison in itself wouldn't necessarily remove racist attitudes. I think it would make it worse. I think it would just fuel tension, and that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, I guess I mean, you were talking about like people being uncomfortable. I think a lot of people in general, specific people, are just very uncomfortable talking about race, but I think it's, I don't know, I guess, I mean, I think like when we're talking about like, I don't think it will increase racism, because I think racism is still bad, like either way, like with or without it. It's just, you have to reform society, you know, like you have to ensure an equitable society is in place. But like moving on from that, I really wanted to talk about like how we view how we view prisoners and how we view crime, and like you know, whether or not, like, because I think for me personally, like I think when I mean before like I sort of started reading about this stuff, I didn't really consider very much about like you know, like the treatment of prisoners, you know, and it's sad that I thought that way, because like I feel like for a lot of us, because we think, oh, they're criminals, so they're bad people, so they deserve to be treated that way. But like I feel like they don't. I don't think anybody deserves to be treated that way. And I think the way in which, like, especially because it's so many people of color that are involved in the prison system, I just feel like I don't know, I feel like there's like this warped view of criminals and criminality and like prisoners and stuff. And I just like wanted people's opinion on like how we view prisoners and why some people, I feel like because we treat them that way, I feel like they're inherently, some people think that prisoners are less than human if we allow them to be treated that way, but I don't think they are. I think there is some kind of rehabilitation that can happen, but like the way in which they're treated doesn't allow for that, you know? So I just wanted an opinion as like a discussion point.
I think fundamentally the way we regard prison is that it's a site in which undesirables within society are like disposed of or deposited of. And the idea is that the dumping of such undesirables in our head resolves the problem and we don't really have a solution. So it is kind of like putting your mind at ease. So as you said, Zara, we yeah, exactly, Sharm, out of sight, out of mind. Once criminals are placed in jail, they're forgot about. It said on that Netflix TV series, The 13th, about how the majority of prisoners, once they're in prison, they're forgotten. They're ultimately they lose all their rights essentially, and there's no way to improve really the way in which prisoners are treated and the way in which we view criminals in prison unless the whole system's reformed. And there you've got a really difficult task at hand. But also, I think it's important to ask yourself the question, how do we really describe a criminal? So say you've got a supermax criminal, how do we really describe that criminal as being violent? Is it because of who they are, i.e. their race, where they've come from, their community, or what they've done? Because often a person is labelled violent because of who they are and not entirely what they have done. But I thought that would be interesting for debate.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes people are labeled for their race instead of like what crime they actually did. I don't really have an answer to like what you said, Morgan, but just answering Zara's question just now. And like throughout my life, I've always, before this month, I've always seen prison as the more quote unquote humane punishment, because I've always, and I think we all as a society have always compared it to like capital or corporal punishment, which is worse than prison. And you know, like me in Malaysia, for example, a couple years ago, like PAS, which is a government party, wanted to like implement the hooded laws, which are like corporal punishment, and like my whole family was against that. And we never really, like for us, and I think for a lot of people around the world, like we never really think like why prison would be wrong / inhumane. You know, same thing that both of you said just now, that we don't think out of sight, out of mind. It's done, and it's like quote unquote more humane than putting people through capital or corporal punishment. And as a result, we just kind of take it for granted. And also, I'm not sure, like I've never had someone like commit a serious crime against me, so I don't know if anybody maybe knows, like if there's a study or something, if like victims get satisfaction out of their people who, like, I think, was it in the book, or like maybe it wasn't in the book, but I read somewhere that some people, like parents or relatives of someone murdered, like they still don't get satisfaction when their child is murdered. And so I don't really have an answer to this, but like, you know, what would be the way to repair that if the crime is just so like emotionally damaging? I don't know. Don't have the answer to that.
What was I gonna say? Okay, so I think like this, what we've discussed so far has really raised some questions about like what is like justice, you know, like what exactly is satisfactory justice for some people. And also I wanted to ask, I guess, because of like everything, like what do you think the purpose of a prison is? We know that it's like to incarcerate people, and I guess as Angela Davis spoke about, it's to sort of, the incarceration in itself is sort of the punishment. But like, do you think that prison, like as it exists now, do you think that it's meant to rehabilitate? Because prisoners, at least those who don't commit like serious crimes like murder and rape and stuff, do you think that they deserve to be rehabilitated and let out back into society to prove that they can be better people? Or like, do you think that it's just there to exist as a form of punishment for people? I just wanted to ask. Somebody want to go?
I think Eden's got her hand raised.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Like it, you know, I read something the other day that basically said, like what Yasmin said, when a child is murdered, many ask the parents what you want from, you know, justice, and people don't really go into specifics. They, you know, because justice is incredibly subjective, you know, and circumstantial based on what the crime is. You know, one person could say, oh, the justice for petty theft is education. Yeah, exactly. You know, one person's justice could be the death penalty, you know. One person's justice could be rehabilitation. And I think that it's important to realize that it is incredibly circumstantial. And I think that poses another issue to abolishing prison, you know. And earlier something was said about abolishing prison for petty crime, you know, and I do agree with that, because there was something I read about the prison industrial complex that basically said the people who are locked up because of drug convictions, petty crime, those are the people who do most of the sort of slave labor in prisons, because many of the murderers and, you know, the serial rapists and those are kept inside their entire lives, and that's an entirely different issue. But I think if we did reform anything, yeah, oh yeah, that's interesting. But I think if we did reform anything about prison systems, it would be the smaller crimes, because I do believe that those can be rehabilitated, you know. And this is separate and kind of irrelevant, but as a person who does believe in the death penalty, it's in that case that it's deserving, you know. I don't believe in the death penalty for people who commit petty crimes, and I believe that rehabilitation, you know, is important for people who commit petty crimes. And also there was a statistic that basically said that, you know, as we've already discussed, petty crime convictions is highest among African Americans. And if we did rehabilitate those crimes, then there would be less of a prison industrial complex. And obviously it is incredibly subjective, and that's just my own opinion. But I just wanted to say justice is incredibly subjective. But in my opinion, it is important to recognize the different types of crimes that should have sort of, you know, rehabilitation rates. Yeah.
Answering Zara's question, I agree with Eden. Some like small petty crimes, I think people could go into rehab. So for example, like drug crimes, and also things like stealing. Like, you know, I hear in the news a lot in Malaysia, poor people stealing to support their families. So that could community rehabilitation, and also like community programs, welfare programs. And then I thought it was interesting what Daria said, because I had the same thought as Sham, and I wrote this down. It's interesting that so many people would rather just commit suicide than life sentence, and I think this phenomenon might contribute to the legitimacy of the prison institution being the go-to punishment, because people think, oh, like the prison must work, right? If people would rather die than go there, like it must be a good punishment for whatever crime the people did. That's what I think.
So yeah, similar to what Yasmin and Eden have just said, I think I completely agree with Eden in the sense that if you've been convicted of a petty crime, there is rehabilitation that is accessible to these criminals, and they are safe enough to put back on the streets, because I just feel like there, with petty criminals, there is a level of rehabilitation that is that exists. Whereas with murderers, serial killers, whatever, there is no rehabilitation in my mind. And ultimately, I think if you're willing to kill someone, then you are either going to face life in a dark hole, or you're going to be sentenced to the death penalty yourself. Well, that's my opinion of what should happen. But ultimately, rehabilitation for petty criminals doesn't often work in prisons because it's such a violent institution. Someone who has committed a criminal act won't be incentivized to do better by being locked up and exposed to further violence in places where prison officers especially, and other convicts sexually, physically assault people in their care. So I think that's another factor you've got to weigh up when you're looking at rehabilitation of certain criminals.
What Morgan said about like murderers not the like no rehabilitation for murderers. I just more like wanted to ask, what do you guys think about political leaders who have indirectly killed people? Like, what do you think about that? Because I'm kind of confused as well.
I think like that's the thing about like convicting people of crimes, because like so many people don't get convicted for things, you know? Like political leaders aren't getting convicted for like indirectly killing people. Like a lot of rapists aren't getting convicted for raping people. And I think like perhaps that raises the wider question of like, is the justice system in general just really corrupt? And like, yeah, of course, but like that doesn't happen. Like I'm not like talking in theory, I'm talking about like prison as we have it today. And I mean, I guess that just proves how like imperfect the prison industrial complex is. I mean, we already know how sort of messed up it is, but like it just proves again that a lot of the people who should be convicted and who should like, I guess in theory, be locked up aren't getting locked up. Like why aren't like the billionaires who are stealing millions of dollars from people, why aren't they getting convicted? Like why, like it's just like it's in general, it just proves how messed up that is. Because like you're saying, like politicians aren't getting convicted, and like Eden's right in saying like that's power. So yeah,
I think you've just mentioned what I was about to say, but that's the harsh reality, I think, of the society that we ultimately live in. And most people who have caused serious harm aren't currently in prison. They will never be in prison, but like it's always powerful people that are always able to remain protected and continue to cause harm. CEOs, managers, artists, you know, sports coaches, etc. And I think, as Eden just mentioned just now, power does manipulate justice ultimately.